Good morning. Bright and chipper, 8 o'clock in the morning. Where's my coffee? So we are we're the Angel Investors Group. So if you go to page 22 in your book, we have all the bios from everyone. All 5 of us. So we're gonna skip the bios and jump right into the panel. What we want to do, by the way, is we're willing to do Q&A actually during the panel. So certainly, if it's pertinent to what we're talking about, we're willing to have you jump right in. The caveat is that hoping that it's at least a somewhat general-ish question rather than the specific. So suppose I'm a biotech in Springfield with $4.5 million in revenue. I mean, we'll try to be, if it's not specific to you or to a close friend, fine. But if fairly generic questions, we're happy to have you jump in on. The way we're going to deal with this is first talk a little bit about experience as an angel, about the group or groups we're involved with, in the process related, and then what we thought we'd do approach-wise is kind of step through stage by stage, how an entrepreneur should be considering the pre-seed period of time, the seed period of time, and then perhaps the angel and the VC period of time. So take it in time chunks in terms of time frame. We thought maybe perhaps a way to looking at it. So why don't we? We'll start in the end with Richard. If you want to just talk briefly about hard to talk briefly about your angel experience, but because we could all talk about that for hours, of course. But just briefly about the angel experience and the process for the Mass Medical Angels and your new cancer program.
I'm Richard Anders. I founded Mass Medical Angels. Before that, I founded another angel group in town called Launchpad. And now I'm founding a third angel group focused only on cancer. And actually, if anyone is interested in that, there'll be a session at 10 o'clock just to meet and greet and talk a little bit about it and brainstorm together. So the process for our group, in a way, the formal process is really easy. But as always is the case, there's a lot more behind a formal process. The formal process is you submit your deck through our website, which passes you to a website called GUST, which is the one that we use. The website sits on, your deck sits on GUST. We have a screening committee that reads the decks, evaluates them, prioritizes them, and presents a short list to our executive committee, which picks which companies come to a meeting. We have 3 companies invited per meeting. We have 6 meetings per year. We typically take 2 biologically inspired companies, 2 sort of device-y inspired companies, which could include services, IT, things like that, and 1 biologically inspired company. Maybe sometimes something straddles both, but at least 1 biologically inspired company, a drug or a diagnostic or something like that, and 2 of the other. Companies come to our meeting, they present, they typically have 15 minutes to present, 10 minutes for questions, 5 minutes for discussion with them outside the room. Members fill out slips. We select typically, again, only 1 company to go into diligence, so that's 1 out of 3, and normally we invest in about 1 out of 2 of those. That's the formal process. Very quickly, because we have a lot of people and a lot of processes. The formal process is fine, but unless your deck is extremely clear or extremely resonant, having a deck up on GUST without a lot of backstop to it is a difficult row to hoe. I strongly recommend that you try to reach out to members of the group, 1 or more, especially in the screening committee, and talk about your presentation, because when the deck is up and the screening committee is discussing it, and someone says, well, geez, they don't have any animal experiments, or I didn't understand this graph, and there's no one in the room who understands the graph because no one's spoken to the company, pretty quickly the conversation can move on. Whereas often there's a very simple explanation for it, or somebody who can get excited about it. So kind of the first tip beyond the simple formality of the process is get to know a couple of people in the screening committee before you present your project naked to the through Best.
So I'm Steve Goodman. I'm one of the founding members of Mid-Atlantic BioAngels. We only invest in therapeutics, diagnostics, and devices. We don't do IT. We will occasionally do an AI-driven diagnostic device, that kind of thing. But for the most part, we tend to shy away from that stuff. Primarily because there are IP issues surrounding the ability to protect the product. So our process is similar to Richard's, but not exactly the same. Our application, we have an application form, and it sits on our website, which is bioangels.net. And if you complete that form, we invite you to submit it along with your deck or any other supporting material that you have. We have a screening committee that meets approximately once a month, depending on the volume. I mean, right now we seem to be suddenly experiencing a surge in applications, and so we had a screening committee meeting last week, and we're trying to schedule another one right away because we couldn't get through all the applications. We look at everything. It's not like, and if we reject you, we will tell you why, so it gives you an opportunity, if it's an addressable problem, to fix it. I mean, if you're in a very competitive space where there's a lot of IP and we think it's going to be very difficult for you to sort of carve a path through that thicket, that would probably be an insoluble problem. But there are other situations where, perhaps you haven't thought through all of the market considerations, that kind of thing. We'll give you that feedback, and then you're free to reapply. So the screening committee meets, as I say, once a month. We either send out invitations to present, or we send you one of these, reasoned rejection letters. If you're invited to present, you come to a meeting. We meet once a month, every month except July and August. We generally have between 3 and 4 companies present. And the question of whether we go into diligence is a question of whether somebody's excited enough to take the lead on diligence. Because we have 5 or 6 interns to manage that process. But if there isn't a lead investor, somebody who's willing to, help herd the cats, or is willing to devote the time, we feel the excitement level isn't high enough. And we've been up and running about 8 years, a little more than 8 years. We have, I believe, 13 investments at this point, several others in active diligence, and we've got our September meeting coming up next week, and we'll be looking at 3 more. So that's our story.
Okay. So my name is David Abraham. I'm a member of Sky Ventures, also actually a member of Launchpad. Sky Ventures is a life sciences focused angel group here in Boston, and invests sort of across the board in life sciences opportunities, so therapeutics, devices, diagnostics, and also med tech, infotech type plays. So the process that we follow is roughly similar to the ones that you've already heard. So there's a screening committee, you get referred in by a member, and then go through a process of sort of selection and sort of interaction with the group. I think one thing that I wanted to mention, and I think Richard sort of touched on it in a moment, is that it's actually fairly important to start networking generally with within the community. Typically the deals that get funded by angels, and angel funds actually, at least in Boston, do syndicate, and we also syndicate sort of between cities as well. Generally speaking, if the company is known to investor, if you've been talking to them for a little while and said, here's what we are doing, it tends to smooth things out a bit. Coming to somebody saying, hey, I need investment now, generally speaking, it's a little bit difficult, right? Because investment is not something that happens in a day, a week, or even a month. Because you're asking in general the turnaround times for these kinds of investments are years. And so these people are going to be putting their money in, right? And then being with you and your success or failures, entrepreneurs, for a long period of time. So you need to sort of build that relationship and that trust before you can be expecting to be successful in terms of actually raising money from angel groups. Let me pause there and turn on to my fellow panelists.
Hi. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Thank you for coming up this early, getting up this early. My name is Linnea Grease, and I work not for an angel group specifically, but for an organization called Alumni Ventures Group, managing something called the First Check Fund. And so First Check Fund is solely a co-investment fund, and we do deals at the earliest stages. We will follow along with angel groups, we'll follow along with institutional seed investors, or even individual investors who have a proven track record. So that's my day job. I build balanced portfolios for the folks that are in my fund. The fund is marketed 100% to individuals, so it allows individuals who don't get access to the venture asset class an ability to, for $50,000, own a portfolio of 30 to 40 companies. So that's my day job. But on the angel investing side, I was instrumental in helping an organization in Ohio get started called North Coast Angel Fund. That's been going on now for 10 to 12 years, and it's solely focused on Ohio, and it functions exactly like the groups that these folks have been talking about, right? So what I want to point out is getting an angel investment is not fast, okay? All the angel groups have their own process. They're usually run by people who are volunteers, because they've come together for a common purpose and they're excited about startups, but for the most part they're doing this on the side. If there's a staff, it's very lean, and so again, to reiterate the issue of the challenge of getting to know the groups way before you need the money is really important. I'm also standing up right now an angel group that's solely devoted to focusing on women founders. It is a very loosely affiliated group. It doesn't even have a name, but it's me and 75 women on a mailing list. And we get together and we fund companies. Again, I live in Cleveland, Ohio, and I work in New York City, so that's a little bit of a commute. But in Cleveland, Ohio, we fund women founders in any industry, just as long as they're local and we know them. So again, not a fast process, a lot of presentations, a lot of corralling cats, unless there's a dedicated fund. If you're waiting for people to write individual checks, that's a whole separate process. So I guess I just caution you when you hear the word angel investing, and I would love to see it different, and maybe these folks have different experience, but I would just say it's not fast. What it is passionate and dedicated to kind of what you guys are building, right? People don't get into angel investing unless they're really passionate about entrepreneurs, about startups, or about the thing that they're looking at. In this case, it's medical, right? So everybody has a passion for figuring out the next great device, therapeutic, what have you. So they usually have experience in the sector or are passionate about, like I said, supporting women. So there's definitely a emotional connection that you'll have with your angel investors versus pure financial investors. Like in my day job, I just write checks and hope I get IRR. I'm not that concerned about everything, the emotional part of it. So that's just a little bit about my background.
Is the Women's Fund independent of Alumni Ventures?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm actually in 3 different groups, one with Richard, Mass Medical Angels. The other 2 groups, there's really nothing additional novel that anyone else has already spoken to. The one thing I wanted to add, though, is the fact that, and it was alluded to a little bit, but I just want to make sure we kind of bring it to the fore, is the fact that you need a champion. In fact, you need champions, plural. Because what happens is, invariably, you get to a presentation, you've gotten all the way through, you're presenting in front of the group, and what happens, the person that was your champion, that was, had taken you through to this point, is sick that day and doesn't show up. So if possible, you want to have more than one person, able to speak. Because what happened was as soon as you leave the room after the presentation, usually the first person who talks is the one that will set the tone for the rest of the conversation. And if it's your champion, they can set the tone that you want. And you've already sort of pre-rehearsed almost. So that's something that I think certainly needs to be stressed. So let's jump into I mentioned at the very beginning talking about the different stages. So Richard, you want to talk a little bit about, we'll go same direction again, about the pre-seed stage or even the seed stage, what types of things entrepreneurs should be thinking about, or how should they approach the whole fundraising in a pre-seed seed stage?
I think that the investment process is a lot like a chess game. Maybe it's not as strategic as a chess game, or tactical as a chess game, but it has a lot of intricacies to it. Maybe the intricacies are more social. But there are a couple of pitfalls that I think companies fall into that seem natural. It seems like you're doing the right thing, but it can sometimes get you into trouble. So you'll often hear early on, well, you got to have a team. Early stage company, they're really trying to scrabble to put together assets, and so they try to put together a team. That can happen in it can happen in many ways, but it can happen in two ways that seem good, but I think come with problems. One of those ways is they put together a team, and their brother-in-law or sister-in-law is in business school and wants to get involved, doesn't know anything about life science, so you got 2 or 3 people together, and the team doesn't really understand life science, but they're there together, and that's your team for a long time, and you put this team together, and it's very hard to extricate yourself, but it's also very hard to get investors to buy into the notion that that team is the right team. So putting together an inappropriate team. On the one side. The other side is often, and I see this too, you're a group of business students, you have a first-year project, you get 9 business students together, and they put together the company, and now the early stage investors are looking at 9 people that they have to fund. 8 of them don't have anything to do for the first 2 years, but they're all business students, maybe from very good business schools, so they want a lot of money, and I'm thinking, oh my God, how are we going to get this thing funded? So one part of the strategy is put together the appropriate team and leave yourself nimble enough so that the team can change and mutate as you get into the point where the investors need to put money. The other piece of thinking about things at the early stage is figuring out how much money you need. A lot of companies, and really more importantly, figuring out the valuation. When you're putting together valuations at the earliest stages, and you're dealing with friends and families, the 3 F's, friends, families, and fools, it's really easy to get a valuation. I mean, Dad doesn't care that it's a 3 million pre or a 9 million pre. So if you ask for almost anything, your dad and your aunt are going to give you the valuation you want. And now you're stuck with that valuation. What a great thing. I got a huge pre-money. It feels really good. You swagger down the streets, you tell your friends. You're got a ball and chain around your ankle of a $9 million pre-money valuation, so that the next round, when you start to get money in, isn't 9 with 3, now a $12 million valuation. And then the next round, they're looking at a $12 million value, and you got to keep bringing in investors. Unless you do things perfectly, there's a hiccup. Once there's a hiccup, you got to take that $18 million at that point valuation and drop it down to $3 million. And if you don't have a board that is extremely flexible and somehow has learned that you got to make these decisions, you have a lot of pain and often a long road before people accept the inevitable, so you can slow up your fundraising. Those are just a couple of the things that people sometimes, I think, miscalculate at the early stages, but should think about.
One of the things we talk about are sort of the 3 legs of the stool that promote investment. The first is the entrepreneur, him or herself. And that goes back to the networking the idea that you should be networking. The more people you get to know and the more people who have a positive assessment both of your company and yourself, the easier it will be for you to gain traction within the investment community. You know, if people, you know, are having cocktails or attending a meeting and they say, oh, I saw this, you know, somebody says, I met this really interesting entrepreneur the other day at a fundraiser or a cocktail party or whatever it was, that becomes a very positive thing. Now you are being marketed by somebody who's not you. But that can't happen unless you get out there and you convince people that you're a competent entrepreneur. The second one is the technology, obviously, has to be novel and interesting and appear disruptive. I mean, one of our criteria is that it can't be just a Me Too product or an incremental improvement on what already exists. It has to actually change the way people are going to conduct their medical business, whether it's, you know, they're going to displace another test, or you're going to, you know, shorten operation times in the operating room by, you know, half an hour or an hour, which is huge money as far as the hospitals and the doctors are concerned. Those are the kinds of innovations that we're looking for, you know, in terms of investment. And the third thing is the business plan. The business plan, there has to be evidence that you've thought about this not just as a, you know, cool, novel technology, but as a product that somebody's actually going to want to purchase. And you have to think about, I mean, the analogy I use is you have a suitcase full of whatever it is you're selling, and you walk into somebody's office. You have to be able to tell me who's sitting on the other side of the table, you know, why are you there, why is this the right person, what's in the suitcase, and why is that person going to buy what's in your suitcase as opposed to what's in everybody else's suitcase? If you can answer those kinds of questions, now I feel like you understand that we're in this for business. We want our money back. Without sales, there won't be any income, and so we won't get our money back. So, you know, it could be the coolest technology in the world, but if you can't turn it into a viable product, it's useless. Useless to us. I mean, it may be useful to somebody. So, those are some of our criteria.
Okay. So, yeah. So I would echo what you just heard. Essentially, it's the three questions of investors, right? So, who are you? What do you do? Why should I invest? Right. So those, as an entrepreneur, those kinds of questions you should be able to answer within a microsecond of waking up in the morning. So that's standard, right? A few other specifics that I wanted to sort of layer on top of that, because I think it's important. One of the things that I think you're hearing from very experienced investors here in the medical community, and they've repeatedly said things like, get to know the members of the group. Well, how do you do that, right? Especially if you're walking in and you haven't had taken the last 5 years to meet all the people, right? So one of the things is that there's something called LinkedIn, right? And you can identify on LinkedIn members of the Angel Group, because we usually put it on LinkedIn. We spend a lot of time working on these things. So I put it on LinkedIn. So you can find members, and then you can figure out, you know, if you don't know the member directly, you can go through somebody else, get a meeting, have lunch, talk with them. I think to Lynn Ann's point as well, another very experienced investor, don't expect it to happen overnight. And so the piece here that sort of underlies this, and it's going a little bit to the point that Richard made, manage your burn as an entrepreneur, understanding that the investment in life sciences takes time. You're not going to get it done in a month. I mean, unless your last name is Zuckerberg, you're going to have a problem funding this, you know, even with friends and family money. So manage the burn. Don't load up on 15 founders. If you're running experiments, particularly if you're allied with an academic founder of some sort, try to get the experiments, particularly the killer do or die experiments, identify those early, get them done in the academic labs. Not always the most robust location for doing this kind of stuff, especially because you're going to have to transfer the data and the science into an industrial setting, but try to get it done in a low-cost way. Another thing I was going to mention specifically, so one of the things that you heard here from all the other experienced angel investors is you're going to be presenting to a group, right? So one of the things that kind of underlies decisions, and I think this was sort of assumed, but I'll make it express, Angel groups are made up of a whole bunch of people who write their own checks, right? So there's some angel groups that may sort of write a check as a group, but the decisions usually get made by individuals at some level. For example, Sky Ventures, you know, as a member of Sky Ventures, I write a check. So you have to convince X number of people in the group to be interested enough in what you're pitching to want to engage in diligence, right? To Lynn Ann's point, these are volunteers, right? So each of them is going to do their own diligence, and then you're going to want to sort of have them be interested enough to write enough checks to make it worth your while. To do that, honestly, it's the business plan, right? The thing that gets you in the door, and it's the presentation. So in general, most of these groups, the process sort of culminates at a point where you as the entrepreneur stand up in front of the audience, made up of potential investors, and pitch your company. To get as far as you did usually means that you've done a good job in the application and the networking, getting the champion, putting together a business pitch. Almost always the decision that people make as to whether or not you're going to invest is based on the pitch, right, the presentation. Because up to that point, most of the people in the room haven't seen a lot of your information, right? Maybe they saw it, maybe they didn't. But the screening committees that we've been talking about narrow, I mean, Sky Ventures gets like 2,000 or 3,000 inbound opportunities a year. I don't have time to look at that. I don't know how the screening committee people do it, because they're actually successful entrepreneurs and investors. But somehow they managed to package it down. And then as we were talking about, you see like 3 investors or 3 opportunities or 4 opportunities per meeting. Meetings generally, for most angel groups, it's like a month, right, 6 weeks. So it's a finite number of opportunities to get to that point. At that point, without a lot of understanding or background necessarily in your market, the investors will make a decision based on your pitch, yes or no, right? And yes is not a yes, like here's a check. Yes is usually, okay, we'll go forward with diligence. So if you've not, and I've seen people, one company actually I wound up investing in, so the guy pitching it was one of these business students, and he did an okay-ish job. So he didn't actually get investment from, and I'll talk about this in a moment, about process, the informal process, but he didn't actually get traction with Sky Ventures. And then afterwards, when I was doing diligence on my own, because I thought maybe there was something there, every time I asked him a question, it seemed like I was learning more and he had a great answer. So ultimately, I wound up writing a check for this guy, but based on his presentation, no. So think about that. Think about what you can do about the presentation. And that's actually part of the connection with, frankly, with the other angel investors. As you begin to network in the community, you show them your pitch, and they can say, well, where do you expect to start making revenue, right? If you're a device company, you're going to want to see that. If you're med tech, you're going to want to see where you're paying customers. If you're looking at doing a therapeutic, how many dollars until you get to exit, right? Because dilution is crucial for early stage investors. Last point I wanted to make, and I'll sort of pass the baton. In general, investment is not, especially at the angel level, is not a particularly clear-cut process. So it's possible that you could go pitch to a group and you find that there's one person in the room for whatever reason that loves your story. The rest of the room hates your story. Just one person loves it. And it turns out the one person maybe is Lynn Ann, and she has a bunch of buddies in Ohio or wherever you don't even know anything about. And then all of a sudden, like, you have this little group that comes up that's informal and says, we'll give you $75,000 or $150,000, whatever it is. And that might be enough to get you to move forward. And then what I've seen happen is that at least the angel groups in Boston, these opportunities get recycled. So you get a little money, you move the ball down the field a little bit more, get some additional data, whatever, you come back like, oh, okay. Because the groups, at least at Sky Ventures, the groups that are pitching there now, this isn't like, just slideware. These are people that have data. If data is what's driving the investment thesis, they have sales. If what is driving the investment thesis is sales. So it's sort of advanced, right? And so it's somewhat of a messy process, and you have to be okay with that as an entrepreneur.
So So I've forgotten the original question.
While you're thinking about it, I just want to jump in and stress something that David said, which is the pitch itself is like a movie trailer. It's not the movie. One of the biggest problems we have with a pitch is somebody comes in and spends 12 of their 15 minutes talking about the science and never gets to the hook, whatever the hook may be, right? Think of the pitch as you want, the decision to go into diligence is like getting somebody to buy a ticket to the movie. You want the trailer to hook their interest. So when you're putting your pitch deck together, think about it as set up a picture as clearly as possible, as early as possible in the presentation about what's the problem, how am I going to solve it. Then, if that's a good thesis, then you can back up and say, this is how we got to this point. But don't lead off with, in 1965, I discovered this particular biological interaction, blah, blah, and so on.
Yeah,
I want one simple clarification, just because a number of people said it, I want to make sure everyone understands. We talk about business plan. Whenever we say business plan, we mean slide deck. At least I do.
All right. I do want to jump on that point, but you.
No, I
don't want to bring.
I was just going to
There's
reiterate.
plenty of room up front if you all want
Yeah.
to sit down.
Yep. I was just going to reiterate, I mean, this is a life sciences conference, right? So, and I'm a generalist. I'm not as sophisticated in life science investing as the folks to my left. So, you have to think about there's devices, right? If you're going to bucket these things generally, there's devices, there's medical IT and devices. Those are sold mostly like widgets, and you have to kind of make the case that there's a customer at the end of the day. And then there's therapeutics, a whole different ball of wax, right? That you're going to have to basically say, look, my customer is the pharma company that I end up selling this thing to. So, again, in your story, you can fall in love with the therapeutic and the lives it's going to save and all of that stuff. But if you can't show the progress to how you're going to get it sold to J&J or some other big pharma company, then an investor just really can't get there unless the investor happens to be equally as intelligent in the science as you are, which, that's a very rare find. So
I would suggest that the customer is almost always another company. There's an end customer, and you got to understand what the end customer wants. But virtually every deal that we look at, virtually every deal has very scant possibilities of getting to revenue on our money, and we always look for a proposition that somebody will take the company out and move it forward. That's kind of universal for us.
right, but on the devices and IT side, I guess I misspoke a little bit. I'm saying that you have to prove to the buyer company that you actually have customers who are going to buy the thing that you've made, right? Whereas in a therapeutic
You'll never
company,
get there.
you haven't gotten there yet, right? You're just getting it to first in man, maybe. I don't know what stage, but.
All right, so we have, we're running about 15 minutes to go. So I did want to talk a little bit more about, funding evaluation, then leave things open for Q&A towards the end, maybe like 5-10 minutes. So the one thing, Richard we were just talking about the whole concept of the business plan. So, well, let's set the nomenclature so we all kind of have a set here. So, there's, in my mind, there's a business plan which is, potentially a 15, 20, 25 page document that you should write, you being an entrepreneur should write, for yourself and plan out the business. It should be, something that you create, it evolves, it changes, maybe you look at it every 2 or 3 months, something like that. And my feeling is it shouldn't necessarily be written in, Queen's English. It can be written in bullets and tables and fairly in a usable format. Okay, let's say that. Now, again, it should be set up, right? It should probably be never sent to an angel investor, because the angel investor will not read it. Now, if they ask for it, obviously you send it to them, but I wouldn't necessarily volunteer it, because I think it's a waste of its sort of But you know, when you to Richard's point, you could send the pitch deck, the executive summary, things like that. I guess maybe that's sort of a two-part question then. So number one, do you believe in a business plan or whatever we use for the terminology? I mean, again, I like to say business plan is that 20, 30-page document. Your slide deck is what you're presenting to the group, and you may have two different versions, by the way, one that you present and the other one that you have that may have an extra 10, 20 pages of addendums if you're sending it out to someone, you know. Why don't we talk about business plan, and then what kinds of things would you send to a if you're an entrepreneur, how would you want to be approached? What would you like to see?
If you're an entrepreneur or an investor.
I'm sorry. What an entrepreneur should send to an investor. If that makes sense.
Can I? Well,
As-
go ahead.
I just had a question. What percentage of your investments are in therapeutics?
I think we're about 50% in therapeutics. See, what we do.
So, I mean, generally, is it?
Oh, you're asking everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah, we are as well, and we just had an exit in therapeutics. I would say about half our exits are in therapeutics as well. We had one a couple weeks ago.
So why isn't there more of a focus on the science then? So I'm kind of curious.
Why don't we, I appreciate the question. We just kind of were.
I didn't say that, by the way.
Okay.
Why don't you hold that question? If it was relevant, but you kind of took us off the.
Why don't you let Lynn Ann go first this time?
That's a good idea. Good.
So the question is what to show. Okay,
Well,
so,
what do you consider? Yeah, what do you consider a business plan? What would you?
so again, I'm a generalist and I try to do 40 portfolio company investments a year for my fund. And then on the side, my side gig is the angel stuff that I do. I don't want to see really more than a 10-page slide deck, quite frankly. It's gotten to the point where anybody who's doing a startup has probably been affiliated with some sort of incubator somewhere or accelerator. And those folks are doing a great job, I think, kind of teaching everybody kind of what to put together and what investors want to see. I am not a science person, so I want to see that you have credibility and that the science makes sense and that there's enough there, but I don't understand if you show me 3 graphs about where molecules hit another molecule and keep it really simple. Not so simple that it's not meaty, but keep it really, really simple for the non-science person. So a deck, cap table, I mean, a standard data room will have your corporate documents, a deck, a cap table. Financial projections are useless, quite frankly. I mean, if you want to go through that exercise for your own self, but they're really not that helpful. And then really just an M&A, like a exit chart, right? Showing me all the companies in your space and where they exited, at what stage, and for how much money.
Okay, sure. So, a few sort of things that have been floating around we could talk about. So, one question, business plan. So, it's a good exercise to think about it. I think that in general, as my other friend David here has mentioned, I think that there are going to be elements of that that are going to surface. The document as a whole, probably not. In general, and this is sort of going to the question that was raised in terms of what percentage do we invest in terms of therapeutics. So we actually invest in a fairly small number of therapeutics that our members are pretty dilution sensitive. And we do consider them, and if there's a way for us to understand how you can get to a value inflection point of significance, and maybe even close to an exit based on the current round that you're asking for, then that's something we would seriously take a look at. But there's certain kinds of investors whose time horizon tends to be shorter. So typical therapeutic investment, you have to be willing to be around for 5, 6, 7 years, or never.
Or longer.
Right.
They take a really long
And
time.
I think that if you're looking at medtech device, you can see exits that are on the order of 36 to 48 months, and that could be reasonable. I mean, that's the kind of deal flow that we're seeing. And so I think that if you're talking about therapeutics, science becomes important, but I think that perhaps what Richard was suggesting is that equally important as the science is, because the most important rule of investing is not how you get in, it's how you get out, right? And so if you're trying to be persuasive in talking to these groups, then you need to sort of address what Lynn said, which is, who else is out there? What's the plan to get the investors out? So it can be acquisition, as we've talked about here. There might be another strategy that you want to advance, whatever it is. M&A for these kinds of investments is, 75–80% of these exits. In terms of providing a real return for angel investors. I think that when you're thinking about your deck, then it's going to be answering a number of different questions. You don't want to have it over-focused, like, 90% science, 10% what the investors want to hear. In addition, one thing I wanted to point out is the type of deck changes in terms of generally investment pitches, changes across investment categories. So it actually is important to understand for our process, to understand sales projections in the near term, like past year really doesn't matter, you put whatever you want there. But for some of the companies that we see, they have sales, right? They actually have paying customers. And we would like to know what your sales ramp looks like and how you plan to get there. Because at 12 months, if your sales ramp is believable, then we believe that perhaps at 24 months, you also might be believable. And in 36 months, maybe we get a nice check, right? So, but that's not true for therapeutics, where, it doesn't really matter what the sales ramp is. It'll never matter to us. What's more important then is context, and that's something else that we haven't really talked about yet, which is, we talk about the hook. So the hook is actually addressing context, which is, why is what you're doing interesting, but realize that the room that you're talking to is a room full of generalists who do not know that your little widget. So I talked with one guy, very interesting thing. It was a scope, and the whole sole innovation was a little thing that clipped on and cleaned the end of the scope, because these interventionalists were actually not able to see what was happening, and so cleaning the end of the scope was a big deal, right? It saves time in the cath lab, and it was a real thing, and they were doing fine. They actually had sales because people, the interventionalists would look at it and say, of course we want that, because that's a problem that every one of us has. So to give me, but I didn't know that because I'm not a cardiologist. And so if you give people context of why this thing is important, and then maybe other companies that are also going after it, now it's a story. And context is important to investors because investors don't invest in your company, they invest in the story because they're hoping that the story will provide a return. I'm going to shut up.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
When I talk about the business plan, what I'm really getting at is the credibility of the entrepreneur. Remember, what's going to happen, as David says, a bunch of individuals are going to give you checks. If they don't trust you, they're not going to give you money. So you have to convince them that you've really thought about how they are going to get their money back. And that's what I'm using shorthand to refer to the business plan. In other words, how are you going to get from where you, and by the way, it sounds as if we invest much earlier, certainly than David does. We're looking at companies which have pre-money valuations of under $10 million and who can get to a liquidity event within about $20 million in invested capital. Because as David said, if you need VC money, if you need $30, $40, $50 million to get to some kind of a licensing deal or an exit, that's not an angel deal, that's a VC deal. And if VCs come in, the first stage money always gets seriously diluted. So we just avoid those deals entirely. But the point is, if we're going to give you a check, we want to know that not only do you understand the science and the impact on the treatment process or the diagnostic process, but we want to know that you've thought about things like the competition. We want to know that you've thought about, so that when we ask a question, you're not just saying, I'll get back to you. You've thought about it. And it doesn't mean you have to have it down cold, but you have to be able to provide credible answers. It's all about building trust. That's it.
Yeah, so business plan, whatever you have in the back office, whatever you built, you could be in prose, it could be in Chinese, it can be, in mathematical formulas. What our currency is a slide deck Once we get the deck, if you go into diligence, we will be asking for all the backroom stuff, and you should be able to put it into a deal room. And if you want to look really good, have your deal room ready before diligence starts, so that we think you've been in diligence before, or at least thought it through, and we can talk another day about some of the things that go in a deal room. But the presentation is immensely important. You will see rubrics that say, here are the elements that should be in a slide deck. You should have this and this and this and that. And to be controversial, not entirely true, but controversial and mostly true, there is no particular element that you must have in a deck. It depends on how you make the presentation. The thing about the deck, generally, is it must tell people as quickly as possible what is compelling. That might be that a Nobel laureate started this based on his or her discovery. It might be that there's an enormous indication or a tremendous unmet need. It could be that you have a unique IP position. There are all these things, but you have to select from the myriad of things that are out there what it is that you do that's compelling. Lay it out as clearly and convincingly as possible and go through the deck. I like more than 10 slides. And for the area that we deal in, I kind of love science. Unfortunately, in a 10 or 20 slide deck, you don't have room for a lot of science. But if you put a little bit in, the point of the deck, it's like the dance of a thousand veils. Each slide suggests that there's more behind it, but you can't get into all of it. So I think it's a mistake.
You can always use an appendix. I mean, not in the presentation you're presenting, but in the appendix if you're sending it out.
But you can also, I think it's a big mistake to have 6 slides about IP. I think 1 slide about IP that says that you're alert to the IP issue, maybe you have a patent or something, it's good enough. Each slide stands for itself and also stands for the proposition that there's a lot more behind it. You really want to tell a story in that deck, because the deck is not just your story, but it is the fact that you know how to tell a story and who you are. A lot's going on in that deck that is not obvious and is further than the deck. I could talk about that all day, but we don't have all day. So I just want to say there's a lot to say about the deck.
To that point, I'm thrilled that I have 4 people that none of them are shrinking violets by any stretch, and all can talk all day, which is great, and I really appreciate that. But let me clarify one thing on what I did say about the business plan. When I said that we don't want to say. It's not that you don't want to show a business plan to an investor. You don't want to show that when you're first approaching them. Is what I really meant to say. So separating that from the due diligence portion, which you probably want to have something like that in there, as opposed to when you're trying to approach them. You're not trying to send out a lot of data, I guess is my point. All right, so let's take a few questions since we've already run out of time.
A couple of quick questions. What's your median investment amount? And are you investing locally, nationally, or internationally?
Largely, but not entirely locally, 250 to 750, I'd say, is within about a standard deviation is our range. But we've done much more and sometimes less.
We're geographically agnostic. We've done WebEx presentations from companies in Israel and England and other places. As far as the amounts, going to David's point, they're individuals making investment decisions. It really depends upon your success and getting people excited. I mean, we've done a couple of deals under 200, but we did one deal in which over 4 rounds we put in over $11 million. So it runs the gamut.
And what was the first round of that up for?
750.
Thanks.
And I was answering first round.
Sure. So our range is a little bit, we haven't gotten to $11 million, but we have gotten $1 million, several $1 million. So Sky is a bit different in the sense that we have individual members, we have strategics, and we also have family offices that participate. And so it's largely dependent on who signs up for the deal, right? You could have a family office want to drop $500,000 or $1 million in. You may have an individual puts in 15. So anywhere from 250 to several $1 million.
So my angel group is really, really, really small. So we'll do 50 to 100K investments, all in the Cleveland, Ohio area, only in women. Narrows down the scope a lot.
I'd say it is interesting that we have, you know, out of the members, the two of us are, I'm originally from Ohio, so we have the Ohio team going on here. So, I'll just speak with Thai. Thai, it can be anything from, you know, on the low end, 250,000 up to 2 million or so. It's a pretty wide range. Next question. I know we don't have time for any more, but go ahead.
I would like to know the post-investing management style that you guys have with this company.
I'm sorry,
You-
what investment?
Post-investment.
You want to go first?
Sure. You're just talking about how you interact after you invest. Angels have virtually, I mean, I'll speak for my group, we're just support to the entrepreneur. Mostly, if they need anything, they'll reach out, but other than that, we're quiet. We don't have any ongoing involvement.
So for Sky, what she said, for Launchpad, they usually want to take a board seat.
Yeah, I think in general, we're just support. We're not looking to run the company. That's why we gave you the check, you know. So we want reports, we want, you know, updates, but we only will, we'll offer to help, but it's up to you to reach out.
It depends on the role we have in the deal. It is not uncommon for us to have a board seat or an observer seat. Our members are pretty deeply steeped in life science, and we like to have somebody close to the company usually.
Way back.
In a successful deal, how often do you pick up your pro rata in the following round?
Full pro rata? I mean, you know, if it's a venture person coming in, we typically, you know, squeeze out a fraction. We encourage members to leave behind, you know, 1 to 2x their investment for future rounds. I would say we, you know, depends on the size of the pro rata, we might hit it, sometimes we oversubscribe, but as the deal starts to get larger, the likelihood of hitting the pro rata gets smaller.
Sure, that makes sense.
What he said.
Same. Same.
Similar thing. All right, I guess I'm
Wait,
good.
one more
All
question.
right, you want to do?
Yeah, done.
Can you throw a quickie?
Well, a quick one. Richard had pointed out the flaws with startups putting out a valuation. Typical startups are pre-revenue. What's your better advice for a pre-revenue startup going in front of an angel?
Did I say don't put out a valuation, or I said don't put out a valuation that's too high? You know, it's a really difficult dance. I will say this, I mean, I try to get some signaling behavior. If I talk to a company, I'll say, what's the valuation? A wise company, honestly, will say, well, you know, that's discussable and whatnot. So, fine. Then I say, well, are you looking at 5 or 10 or 1 to 5? And that usually is an innocuous question. If they say, we think this is a $12 million pre, I say, great, and I know what I need to know. If they say, you know, we can discuss it, it's around 5 or somewhere in that range, that's also discussable. So you don't have to give it exact valuation, but you know, 10 million is a hard number for us. We have a lot of difficulty getting past it. If you're an early stage company or a family and friends and you're at 8 or, you know, 10, I mean, that's good for us to know, and it's good to know early. It doesn't waste anyone's time.
So data is your friend, right, on this one? There's a bunch of data available, publicly available. There's also the PitchBook database, which is really expensive, but somebody you know can get access to it, I'm sure. So, you know, do your homework, find out what other companies are being valued at, and do some sort of triangulation on that.
It goes back to the credibility question. Have you thought about what other companies in your space are commanding in terms of multiples?
Don't think like an internet company.
We have another panel starting here in just a few minutes. If anyone has any questions, please meet with the